Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining today's webinar entitled Designing and Conducting Research on Policy Implementation. My name is Chad Spoon and I am the Communications and Partnership Manager at Active Living Research. I'll be the moderator for our webinar today. Before we start with the presentation, I want to review a few housekeeping items to let you know how you can participate in today's session. Here's a screenshot to show you an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer desktop in the upper right corner. By default, you are listening to the webinar through your computer speaker system. This means if you can hear music through your computer, you'll be able to hear the presentations. If you would like to listen using your telephone, just locate the audio pane and select telephone. The dial-in information and access code will then be displayed. All lines have been muted, but you have the ability to ask questions using your questions pane. Simply type in your question and click send. At the end of the presentation, we will do a question and answer session and take as many questions as we have time for. And for any questions that we don't get to on today's webinar, we will also have our panelists answer after the webinar, and we'll be posting those in a PDF document as an FAQ online with the recording of the webinar. Today's webinar is the last of a set of 3 web forums that Active Living Research has sponsored, covering important issues that researchers face when studying physical activity in the built environment. We've previously held webinars on designing and conducting pre-post studies in parks and also around public transit projects. Today we'll be discussing research on policy implementation, and a recording and/or the slides from each of the 3 webinars will be available at activelivingresearch.org/news-and-events/archives. Before we get to our speakers, I wanted to give a brief overview of Active Living Research. We are a program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that uses evidence to prevent childhood obesity and create active communities, especially among youth in low-income and minority communities which are at highest risk for childhood obesity. We focus on the translation and dissemination of research to inform policy debates and guide the development of effective solutions. Our website has a library of research briefs, infographics, presentations, tools and measures, recorded webinars, and other resources that you can use to make the case for healthy schools, parks, communities, and policy change. And our new mission now is to partner with stakeholders to apply the lessons of research to building great communities. Today's webinar will feature 2 leading researchers who will discuss the design and methods of conducting research studies in the area of implementation science as it relates to policy, practice, and environmental changes to promote physical activity. First, we'll hear from Paul Estabrooks. Dr. Estabrooks is a professor in the Department of Human Nutrition, Foods, and Exercise at Virginia Tech. Dr. Estabrooks' work uses integrated research practice partnerships with a goal to develop broad-reaching health promotion strategies that can effectively increase and maintain healthful lifestyle behaviors at the individual level and lead to sustainable programs, policies, and practices at the organizational level. On today's webinar, he will provide a brief overview of implementation science theories and models, research designs, and outcome assessment. Second, we'll hear from Keshia Pollack, who is an associate professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management and also associate director of training and education for the Johns Hopkins Center for Injury Research and Policy at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Pollack's research uses injury epidemiology, health impact assessment, and translational research to advance policies that create healthy environments where people can live, work, play, and travel safely. Dr. Pollack also leads, along with Active Living Research, the CDC-supported Physical Activity Policy Research Network Plus, which we know as PAPRN Plus. Today, she will discuss the use of multiple and mixed methods for implementation science, highlighting the application of these methods for physical activity research. So with that, we will turn ourselves over to Paul. Okay, Paul, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Chad. And let me just get the slides up for everybody here. Hopefully you can see that okay. So I'm going to be really quick and run through in about 15 minutes or so a lot of content related to implementation science. And so one of the things we get asked a lot in my world is, what is implementation science and how does it differ from things like effectiveness research or things like applied research? And so when we think about implementation science, there's a lot of definitions out around too, and so I'm going to give you a couple that I like that come from the Fogarty International Center. And so the first one you can see here is it's the study of methods to promote the integration of research findings and evidence into healthcare policy and practice. Obviously that one's a little bit narrow for many people like Dr. Pollack and myself who do work outside, both within and outside of healthcare systems. And so I like the follow-up definition here, which focuses on the adoption or uptake of evidence-based intervention by delivery agents and clinical or community organizations, which gives it a little bit broader sense. And when we think about research objectives related to implementation science, you can see on this slide, it's really looking at things that support different ways that we can understand and overcome different types of barriers to adoption, adaptation, integration, scale-up, and sustainability. And again, kind of the key term here is this evidence-based interventions, tools, policies, or guidelines. So the typical next question that we get from an implementation science standpoint is, well, when we say evidence-based intervention, what exactly does that mean? And just like the definitions of implementation science, there's it's kind of a blurry line in some ways, but I think that folks could agree on a standard related to the highest level, which would be something like this, where it's published in a peer-reviewed journal. It's part of a systematic review that demonstrates consistent efficacy of a given strategy across a broad range of participants and maybe settings or communities. And so when Dr. Pollack talks a little bit about the worksite project that they have going, you'll hear her talk about things like point of decision prompts and other types of strategies that you might pull from somewhere like the community guide. So where we have these systematic reviews that say, hey, we've now made a good synthesis of the literature and these are evidence-based approaches. So an implementation science study would really focus on trying to move these types of interventions into practice. You could also go to kind of the minimal level of what an evidence-based intervention would be, and that could be something that's published a single study in a peer-reviewed journal, but might not be part of a systematic review. Another thing to add to the complexity here is that there is a school of thought, of which I am one, that implementation science also talks about the movement of evidence-based principles and not necessarily packaged programs or policies that you have to follow step by step, but actually have principles that can be applied across multiple settings and populations. So moving from our definition, we'll talk a little bit about some models that are available within implementation science. And as Chad said at the beginning, a lot of the work that I do uses integrated research practice partnerships, and we oftentimes call this a systems-based approach. This theory that you see, or the model that you see up in front of you right now, is from Wandersman and colleagues. And it basically describes that if we're trying to move the evidence base into practice, there's basically three systems that interplay with one another to try and move the evidence into the hands of the folks that would ultimately use it. And so you see at the top of this model here, we have the distilling of information. So this is kind of our research system that I'm circling here with the pointer. And that's where we do our reviews of literature, potentially start to talk about translation and dissemination here. Then we have on the far end the delivery system, where within that delivery system there's a general capacity to use evidence-based approaches, and then there's also a need for a capacity that's specific to the given evidence-based approach that is trying to be translated into practice. And with Wandersman's model and what we use in terms of integrated research practice partnerships is develop this thing that we call a support system, where there are groups that focus on, they understand the research, they pull that synthesis and try and develop strategies that build general capacity within delivery systems to help them get these evidence-based approaches into practice. And then they also do trainings or other methods to try and get this innovation-specific capacity that can be taken in and used within a particular public health or community or healthcare setting. And so there's a lot of, so that model doesn't give us a whole bunch in terms of mechanisms. This model that you're looking at now was by Tricia Greenhall. It's been around for a while, and for those of us who have had the time and inclination to review Rogers' diffusions of innovations theory, this really takes a lot of the components from that theory and moves it into a model related to understanding how dissemination works. And you know, this is something that's also important from an implementation science standpoint, is that implementation really is a process that has some temporality to it, in that, you know, there's at some point in time a decision to either use or not use research. Then there's the uptake and the initial preparation to get that evidence into practice. Then there's initial implementation testing, and then there's sustainability of that level of implementation over time. And that might look a little bit different for interventions that are programmatically based or policy based, but in each one of those cases there is this level of temporality, that there's a decision, an initial implementation, and then the degree to which maybe a policy is enacted over time. And so with the proliferation of models that is out there, and for those, I don't have the reference up on the screen here, but for those who are interested, there's a great article by Pollack and colleagues from a couple of years ago that reviews through the number of implementation science theoretical models and approaches that are out there, and it's well over 50. And so one of the things that folks have been trying to do over the last few years is to try and synthesize these things and come up with one overarching model, and that's a challenge. The table you see on here, I know it's probably a little bit challenging to look at, but in the columns across there, there's the different implementation science theories that are out there, and then on the rows, it reflects some work by Laura Damschroeder and her colleagues, where they've tried to come up with a consolidated framework for implementation research. And you can see that it has 5 different areas. On here, it's a little bit complex to look at, but if I move you to the next slide here, you can see the figurative description of this particular theory. And the key point here is, you know, for those of us who use ecological approaches, it looks like an ecological model, and in fact it is, but the individuals here are not typically the individuals who will have health benefit from our policy, environmental change, or program approaches. It's the individuals who will either be responsible for implementing the evidence-based approach or making decisions related to if a system will enact a policy over time. And those individuals are influenced by the inner setting of their specific organizational or regional structure. That structure is influenced by the context that surrounds it, whether it be other communities, whether it be other healthcare organizations that may be putting pressure on a given setting to adopt new policies or adopt new intervention strategies to address a given health outcome. And then across that, there's this idea of basic intervention characteristics, and this kind of goes back to the Rogers diffusions of innovations theory, where we talk about things like the degree to which the new evidence-based approach provides an advantage over and above what is currently in operation, that it's compatible with organizational mission, values, and resources, and those types of things. And then finally, we have this temporal type of process where there's an initiated plan, the engagement of the key stakeholders that will be responsible for not only making the decision about whether an intervention can be implemented, but also those folks that would ultimately do the work to get an evidence-based intervention into practice. And so from there we'll transition to, oops, my slide didn't go. We'll transition to a different type of model, which the three models that I walked through there really are more theoretical approaches that try and help people with understanding the mechanisms and processes by which implementation may occur. There's also implementation outcome models, and the REAIM framework is one that I've worked with a good bit that really provides a number of different outcomes that are of interest to people that are doing this type of translational work. And within this model, you can see we have our typical focus on effectiveness. So how effective is the evidence-based strategy when we move it into the typical community or worksite setting, for example. But it expands beyond just looking at effectiveness to also looking at things like reach in terms of the proportion of people that benefit from a given policy and the representativeness of those folks that will benefit from that policy. And then it moves to these more organizational aspects related to organizational adoption of a policy or an environmental change strategy, the degree to which they implement that with some level of fidelity and the cost of that implementation, and then the degree to which that policy or environmental change or program is maintained over time is also assessed. And so when we're doing an implementation science approach, oftentimes we're looking at very different outcomes or additional outcomes than what we would use in a typical effectiveness type of strategy. So from that standpoint, so we've got some idea on what the definition of implementation science is. We've got some theoretical models, some outcome model approaches. What are the types of trials that can be done from an implementation science standpoint? And I really like an article that Jeff Curran and his colleagues published a few years ago now and have followed up on a little bit that try and outline different types of effectiveness implementation hybrid trials. And so I'm going to go through each one of these in a little bit of detail. And so when we talk about a type 1 hybrid effectiveness implementation trial, this type of trial has a primary focus on the effectiveness of the policy or an environmental change intervention. So when we do this policy, do we actually see health-related changes in the population that we are targeting? And then it has a secondary focus on the implementation of that policy or an environmental change. And so it typically has descriptive type of data on the context, things that we might get from key informant interviews. And so when you hear Dr. Pollack's presentation, you'll hear a lot about mixed methods. And this, in some ways, is why mixed methods are so important within implementation science, is that, you know, we are looking at these objective outcomes often at the population level, but we're also looking at more qualitative features to provide us a sense of what the context is and what barriers or facilitators might be in place to either help us or hinder us in trying to get a policy up and running. And so the primary outcome for this type of trial is typically the change in the individual or population health. And so if I wanted to try and apply implementation outcome model to this, if we put a REAIM assessment here, you can, the key thing that I would point out on this one is that usually with an effectiveness implementation type 1, where we're intervening is at this level, which is the effectiveness. We're trying to figure out the effectiveness and maybe individual level maintenance, so how long the changes at the population level occur as a result of that policy. But then when you look across the other REAIM dimensions in terms of the reach, you know, the proportion of folks that are influenced by that policy, their representativeness, the type of setting that that policy has been applied in, and then the degree to which there's implementation fidelity related to that policy, the cost of that, if there's adaptation needs. Most of those things in this type of trial, in type 1 trials, would be descriptive. And you could have quantitative components there, but oftentimes the qualitative information is more compelling and provides better direction for how one might move forward when trying to take things from an effectiveness-focused trial to an implementation-focused trial. So the type 2 effectiveness implementation trials has a balance where the key thing here is that there are in fact 2 interventions that are being evaluated. One is the policy intervention or the environmental change that's intended to improve population health, and the second one is that there's an implementation strategy or some sort of intervention that tries to promote the uptake, delivery, I guess delivery is the wrong word, but the uptake implementation, for lack of a better term, of a policy approach as well. So you might have some settings that have specific incentives that are built in to try and support a greater uptake of a policy, and then others would be control sites where you're just providing information on the policy and its benefits. With this one, you know, the unit of analysis is typically of both the population as well as the staff and setting levels in terms of the people that would be implementing policy approaches. And the primary outcome is typically implementation fidelity, so the degree to which a policy is put in place and then monitored, managed, and enforced, as well as the effectiveness of that policy maybe compared to another type of policy approach. And so with this one, you know, really when we're looking at intervention, it's really that we could be intervening across effectiveness, the adoption or uptake, and implementation, where we're a little more descriptive around the reach and maintenance aspects of this. And then finally, we get into the type 3 focus trial, which really is the primary outcome is related to the implementation, the evidence-based policy uptake. It's the adherence to that policy in terms of how there are structures in place to ensure that the policy is enforced over time, its consistency across different settings within a given organization or community, and its sustainability. And so from a re-aim perspective, you could see here we really move from being descriptive across the board with with some exceptions related to adoption and uptake, but the primary intervention is at how do we get this implemented within a given system or community, and then potentially also intervening upon the sustainability or the continued monitoring of that policy to ensure that it stays in place. And so I'll finish up with a final slide here that just gives you a sense of, when you're talking about implementation science, what a research agenda in this area might be. And I'll just go through this. The agenda would be that you try and develop and test health promotion policy and environmental changes that can be adopted across a variety of settings, have the ability for sustained and consistent implementation at a reasonable cost, reach a large number of people, especially those who could most benefit, and produce replicable and long-lasting health improvements. And so, you know, when we're thinking about implementation and these different outcomes within this research agenda, as you look there, and hopefully as you saw when we went through the effectiveness implementation hybrid designs, really each one of those bolded words within this final slide provide an opportunity for intervention and improvement. And so as we move forward into Dr. Pollack's presentation here, hopefully you'll get a good sense of what applying mixed methods to this field of study looks like, and then what a project might look like as you're moving forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Paul, for that. That was very informative. Just to remind all of our attendees that if you do have a question for our speakers, that you can enter it into the questions pane of your control panel, and that we will be able to answer those, and those questions that we don't get to on today's webinar, we will follow up and post online in an FAQ document with the recording of the webinar. One thing I'll note, there were a couple comments that came through about asking for links and sources to a couple of the tables and references that Paul provided in his presentation, and we will make sure that we include those sources for folks that are interested in following up and looking at them in more detail in the FAQ question document that we'll post after the webinar. And one quick follow-up question for you, Paul, that kind of came through. When you do an implementation research project, do you have to assess all re-aim dimensions?
You know, that we get that question a lot, and I would say that it's really good if you can do, as if I were to go back up to a slide like this, where you do a really good job of the assessment of the specific re-aim dimension that you're intervening upon, and then try and provide good, thorough, descriptive information across the other dimensions. It's virtually impossible to try and design one study where you would intervene upon all of the re-aim dimensions, just because, I mean, that would be a lot of different interventions that you're trying to put into place. But really the intent is that if you're trying to balance your reporting of internal and external validity factors, and by providing descriptive information on the things that you're not necessarily intervening upon, it gives good context and allows people to replicate your work, whether that be a delivery system or another research team.
Great, thank you. And we'll come back to you after we hear from Keshia. So Keshia, I will turn that over to you now.
Okay. Great, thank you, Chad. And thanks, Paul, for that great foundation. I'm also going to go through so we have time for questions at the end. And as Chad mentioned earlier, I'm going to talk a bit about methods that we use in our implementation research studies, and I'll give you an example about a current project we have going on right now. Before I begin, I want to just acknowledge and state that this presentation is a product of Prevention Research Center, the one here at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and was supported by the cooperative agreement number shown on the screen from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And the findings and conclusions in the presentation are mine and do not necessarily reflect the official position of the CDC. So I'm going to just jump right in and say that I want to begin by distinguishing between multiple methods and mixed methods. And I'm sure all of you have heard of these terms and you're familiar with them, but I'm going to focus on mixed methods today because they are different than when using multiple methods, which essentially are using qualitative and quantitative projects or methods within a larger project that are pretty complete on their own. But when we think about mixed methods research, we're really talking about the integration throughout, and I'll show some examples of that in a moment. When we look at mixed methods research as a field, if you look at the late 1980s or so, mixed method designs were ones that basically included at least one quantitative method and at least one qualitative method. So if there was a quantitative survey combined with key informant interviews, for example, this was considered mixed methods research. Over the years, mixed methods research has sort of been refined a bit, and we see about a decade later in the late 1990s that the definition evolved to really highlight the mixing in all phases of the research. And by mixing, it's really, I mean the integration of qualitative and quantitative methods. And this includes in terms of inferences made and the interpretation of the results. The authors Ted Lee and Tasha Corey, who've written a lot on mixed methods research, also called this mixing back in the early 2000s mixed model research. Since that time, there was a paper published in 2007 that was a composite definition based on several definitions of mixed methods research and from really experts in the field, where mixed methods research is thought of research that combines elements of qualitative and quantitative research approaches. Again, it could be primary data collection in terms of surveys and key informant interviews or focus groups. And you are combining the methods during the data collection, analysis, interpretation to really understand, I think, at a deeper level, what you might get from using one method or the other. And let me just say that at the end of this presentation, I'll have a list of references and resources for you to learn more about this. There are classes on mixed methods research, and again, I'm just giving a very high-level overview of mixed methods research and how you can use it for your implementation research. Among the various purposes for mixed method designs, Green highlighted 5 major ones I think are important to mention. The first is triangulation, and this is really testing the consistency of findings obtained through different instruments or across different studies. And so looking to see how are your survey findings triangulating, for example, with your interview data. Another purpose is complementarity, which is really saying how do the results from one method help to clarify or illustrate the results from another method. Another purpose is development, where we think of how one method helps to shape subsequent methods or steps in the research process. Another purpose is initiation, where using one method might help to stimulate new research questions or challenges from another method. And finally, expansion, and this is really saying, how do we get to this deeper level or this richness of detail in the study by looking deep into the qualitative methods or the quantitative methods? So again, expanding our understanding of some phenomena from using multiple ways of getting at the research versus just one method. One of the people I like to read a lot of their writing on mixed methods research is Creswell, and I have a reference at the bottom for his book that published on designing and conducting mixed methods research. And here are just some core characteristics of mixed methods research. I won't read all of these verbatim. You'll have the slides after the webinar. But again, the thing that really distinguishes mixed methods from multiple methods is that we are talking about mixing or integrating or linking various forms of data by combining or merging them concurrently or sequentially by having them build on another or embedding them within one another. Ultimately, we can use mixed methods in multiple phases of a study, and I'll tell you how we're doing that in a moment, or just in one single study. And I think what I really like about mixed methods research is that every time we've used a mixed methods design, there have been added benefits of understanding the issue better than if we had just used quantitative data or qualitative data. These are the major mixed methods designs. I'm not going to go into all of them today in the interest of time, but I will highlight just a couple because I'm going to talk about how we're using them in our project in a moment. But I will say one of the distinguishing characteristics of these designs, particularly the sequential designs versus the convergent, is that in our sequential designs, you're starting with qualitative methods and leading to quantitative methods or vice versa. And if you look at some of the resources I provide at the end, they're really nice diagrams that illustrate how these various methods flow together. But I want to show you a convergent parallel design, and this is one that I've used in several studies. And with a convergent parallel design, you are collecting your quantitative data and analyzing it. At the same time, you're collecting your qualitative data. And you're comparing or relating the two and then bringing them together for interpretation and reporting. Whenever you read a study, for example, that says that they've used mixed methods, really look to see, well, what's the design that they're using? And I think this is something that I see people forget to mention sometimes when they say they're using mixed methods. You're using one of the designs that I just listed on this prior slide, but really look to see how the data are being mixed together during the data collection and the analysis and interpretation. Our current project I'm going to talk about in a moment uses a multi-phase design, and this basically combines the concurrent design I just showed with some sort of sequential collection of quantitative and qualitative data over multiple phases of a study. And what's really beneficial of this design is that each iteration builds on the previous studies. And it's also a way, though, to connect across the primary study objective. So there's your overall objective, and you are using multiple phases of the research process, and you are also using this concurrent or sequential collection of data and analysis. I found that these multi-phase designs are really important and helpful for addressing a set of incremental research questions, and we've used it in the past for comprehensive program evaluations. So let me just walk you through a brief example to tell you how we're thinking about this in practice. During my introduction, Chad mentioned PAPRIN Plus and the Physical Activity Policy Research Network Plus coordinating center is housed here at Johns Hopkins, and we also have a collaborating center that focuses on research. And just for those of you who are unfamiliar with PAPRIN Plus, there are sort of three main aims. It's to promote high-quality research, vital to the development, implementation, evaluation, and sustainability of policies, environments, and programs that increase physical activity, specifically walking. We also emphasize translation of research into policy and practice, and integrate the translation, dissemination, and implementation of research and practice into training. So for our PAPRIN Plus research project, we're working with colleagues at the University of Maryland School of Medicine and at the Maryland Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, our state Department of Health, looking at workplace policies to promote physical activity. So data from our state agency indicate that working Marylanders spend an average of 9 hours a day at work, and they've looked to see why or how that ends up being a barrier in terms of limited time to be physically active. There's also research that says U.S. adults spend upwards of 55% or so of their waking hours at work. So with this in mind, there's a lot of attention around opportunities to promote physical activity at work. And in 2010, our State Department of Health, DHMH, initiated Healthiest Maryland Businesses. And this program actually was funded from a CDC 1305 grant, and it's a statewide worksite wellness promotion program. Businesses can enroll voluntarily in the program, and the benefits of being part of Healthiest Maryland Businesses is that businesses receive education and technical assistance, really around how do you promote workplace wellness based on where you are. So if you're a small business with limited resources, or you're a large business that has 5,000 employees and an on-site recreation center or gym or fitness center, how do you take advantage of those resources? In addition, there is some additional recognition from the governor, and the individuals who help to implement this program really promote using evidence-based strategies and how the work sites can implement evidence-based strategies. So when we partnered with the state, there were questions about, well, how's the program being implemented? And what lessons can we learn to help other work sites who are implementing similar programs? And so we came up with these 4 aims to, 1, explore which policies work sites in the program are using to promote physical activity with a focus on walking. Also, we wanted to explore the decision processes that businesses use to select those policies. How are businesses deciding that they're going to promote or have stare prompts, for example, or promote walking meetings, or have policies around breaks that you can take throughout the day, and think about how these policies or the decision processes differ for physical activity versus other health promotion initiatives. We also are exploring the facilitators and barriers related to implementing these policies in the work site. And we're also looking at, well, what are some successes for physical activity generally amongst a subset of work sites in the program? So when we developed this study, we employed a multi-phase design. And so phase 1 is using the convergent parallel design I mentioned earlier, where we are collecting quantitative data using the CDC Workplace Scorecard, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And we're also collecting qualitative data. We are conducting semi-structured key informant interviews with the individuals throughout the state who are the coordinators and working with the businesses on the ground. We have some preliminary data from both of these where we're starting to compare and relate them across, and we will continue to do that through an iterative process throughout this phase of our research, and also we'll integrate the data from both the quantitative and qualitative data together into the interpretation and reporting. The second phase of our study is what's known as an explanatory sequential design. And what this means is that we're taking our quantitative data that we collected from the Workplace Scorecard, and we are using that to inform additional qualitative data collection. We are planning to start in the new year a multiple case study where we are looking at a subset of the businesses in the program using document review and conducting interviews with human resource managers and CEOs when available to better understand how the program is being implemented and to address our study aims. Oops, sorry, wrong way. And the other thing that we are doing with this design is trying to really explain how the decisions are being made around implementation, and we are going to compare these data with the data we collected from the first phase and ultimately be able to conclude this research by having a better sense of how these projects are being, our policies are being implemented in the workplace. Just a little bit more on the quantitative data. Again, we're using the CDC Worksite Health Scorecard that has 16 domains and 122 questions that assess how evidence-based health promotion strategies are implemented at work sites. Of the scorecard, we're focusing on certain domains, so the demographics of the work site, organizational supports, physical activity, and community resources. To date, we have 2 waves of data. So wave 1 was the baseline data. Wave 2, which just went out in the field earlier this year, we added some additional physical activity policy questions to the study. So we asked individuals if they were doing things like if they had stair prompts, for example, if they were using walking meetings, if there were treadmill desks or other types of interventions in the worksite to promote physical activity. And we also asked a screening question in wave 2 about being considered for involvement in our multiple case study. These data, we'll be presenting some of these data at the upcoming Active Living Research meeting in early February. As far as the qualitative data, we are conducting semi-structured key informant interviews with the regional coordinators, and the regional coordinators are responsible for the businesses that are in certain parts of the state. So this is a map of Maryland, and we have individuals that are responsible for businesses in certain counties on the west, or down on the eastern shore, or in the upper shore, or right here in Baltimore City. And so those interviews will help us, again, better understand the kinds of support they're providing to businesses. And as I mentioned, we have that screener question that we added to the second wave of data, where we will then use a process where we're sampling for heterogeneity to select businesses that are large and medium-sized and small from various sectors to then get a better sense of what can we learn about the facilitators and barriers of implementing these policies in the work site. To date, we've conducted nearly all of the interviews with the coordinators. We'll actually do our last one tomorrow. And we are then planning, as I said, to go into the work sites in early 2016. Paul in his talk mentioned RE-AIM, and the data that we have, that we will collect from our instruments, were really take RE-AIM into mind as we developed our instruments. So for example, we have questions around reach and adoption, around maintenance, and around barriers, and I think that we will ultimately, again, come up with some really useful information that we can share with other work sites who are implementing these types of programs. And so I didn't show any of our preliminary findings today because, again, in the interest of time, this is really about the methods, and I wanted to present an overview of the methods that we use in our implementation research. As I think about all of the studies I've conducted in this area, they've all used mixed methods, and I think they're really particularly useful for implementation science as you're trying to understand how things are happening, what are the facilitators, barriers, what's adoption like, and these questions tend to lend themselves to both quantitative methods and qualitative methods. One thing I always like to point out is that using mixed methods is very valuable and useful, but you also need more expertise and resources when using mixed methods. So accounting for the time to develop the qualitative instruments, to actually conduct the qualitative data, analyzing those data, in addition to the qualitative data as well, the quantitative data as well. And so ultimately, sometimes we might not have individuals around us to, or our own expertise might not be in both sides of the methods, but pulling together the teams that can help us utilize mixed methods is just such a great asset, and I encourage you to think about doing that for your work. My information is up here on the slide, and I said I would leave you with some resources. Here's just a list of the references I cited with a few additional resources. I also want to mention that there is a Journal of Mixed Methods Research, which is a great journal to read if you're interested in how people are using mixed methods for a variety of topics, and also how to write this up. I mean, it's challenging to think about how do you document and talk about the mixing of these methods in a way that's acceptable to a peer-reviewed journal, and this is a great example of a journal that actually highlights these papers. And so that's it, and I will stop here and turn it back over to Chad. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Keshia. That was great. One quick just follow-up question. Could you go over briefly the difference between multiple methods and mixed methods?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Let me just pull back. Let me go back to one of these earlier slides here. And sorry about the ambulance in the background. For those of you who haven't been to Baltimore, I'm right next to the hospital. So I think that the best definition that I'll pull up is probably this one. And so if we look at this slide, when we think about mixed methods, again, we're talking about the type of research where we are collecting qualitative data and quantitative data, and we are really integrating them during the data collection phase, during the data analysis phase, during the interpretation phase. So I like to think about how it's this integration throughout the process. When we have multiple methods, which is different from the mixed methods design, it involves qualitative and quantitative projects or aspects of a project that are sort of done in isolation. You're not mixing the findings together. Now, I've done research using multiple methods, and the big difference is really in the integration of the data and the mixing. So that doesn't happen for the multiple methods. So I might have a paper where I describe the survey data by itself and the key informant interview data by themselves, and then make some conclusions at the end. But in no way am I trying to figure out how the quantitative data can inform the qualitative data or vice versa, or trying to understand, how do we triangulate those in a way to get a deeper understanding of the phenomenon. So it's really about separating when you have multiple methods, and then for your mixed methods, it's really integrating them, as I said, during the data collection, design, interpretation phases.
Great, thank you. So with that, I think we will go ahead and open up the question and answer session for both the panelists. So as a reminder, if you do have a question or a comment for the speakers, please enter that in the question function, and we will get to those questions now, or if not, we'll collate them and post them online later. One question for Paul, and then maybe Keshia can add in as necessary, because it's kind of maybe a two-question here. First, Paul, could you provide an example of a project that you have applied the hybrid effective implementation design model? You talked about 3 types, and if you could basically provide some examples of that, and also maybe more broadly, and for both of our speakers, what are some examples of implementation interventions?
Okay, so I guess a good example of implementation effectiveness hybrid trial that we're working on right now is one where we are trying to determine the degree to which, and this would be what I would call an implementation effectiveness type 3 design. So our primary outcome is on implementation fidelity, cost, consistency. And our view towards effectiveness is to monitor effectiveness over time, and hypothesize that the intervention that's targeting the health change in our patients will significantly improve over time. So the implementation intervention in this case is a consultation type of evidence-based implementation intervention where we did a quasi-experimental trial, and with one region of chronic care coordinators within a healthcare system that were interested in doing obesity treatment work, We did a consultation approach to train them on delivering evidence-based lifestyle intervention strategies through either the telephone or one-on-one sessions or group sessions. And we went through a process where we interacted with those care coordinators on a quarterly basis, did action planning with them, did role-playing on specific strategies. We had them do self-evaluation of how this might fit within their work, and we did basic instruction on the tools and techniques. And what we basically monitored over time was, first of all, the degree to which that region increased their weight management services that they were provided relative to other regions that received just a single training on the intervention materials. And then we also are looking at the degree to which we have higher implementation quality amongst those that get this strategy. And so, you know, we basically will determine if the consultation method was effective in improving reach and implementation quality, and then our secondary outcome is to determine the degree to which, we're using a matched cohort design, the lifestyle intervention actually changes weight within the patients. And so you end up with, you know, you have the lifestyle intervention that's testing the clinical or the effectiveness side, and then you have the consultation intervention that is trying to improve implementation of that lifestyle intervention.
Great, thank you very much. Keshia, do you have anything to add in terms of just examples of implementation interventions, or should we move on?
I'll just add, I think Paul gave a great answer. I'll just add, you know, I do a lot of work in injury prevention and policy, and, you know, we did a study that we wrapped up looking at residential sprinkler policies and how they were being just implementation of them at the state level and at a few localities. And I'll say for that particular study, the intervention we were looking at, again, was this sort of requirement that certain homes had to have sprinklers, and as part of our study of the implementation of how that was working, we used multiple methods, and in using multiple methods, we conducted a national survey to just sort of get a better understanding of what was happening, and then we did this multiple case study. And again, that's a perfect example of using these two separate methods. We didn't integrate those at all, and so our findings said this is what we learned from the national study, and this is what we learned from the multiple case study. And in that one, our primary outcome was really the adoption of the policies. You know, what were the facilitators and the barriers? How were people measuring the progress in keeping track and monitoring how the policy was being adopted and carried out in a certain community or in the state? And so I think I'll just say that was an example of something we finished up recently, that we were able to use multiple methods and then also use a variety of outcomes that Paul talked about when he mentioned re-aim.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so our next question, I think this is going to be for you, Keshia, related to the design of your worksite study. How are the quantitative surveys informing the qualitative survey in the sequential design of your study? And also, could you do them at the same time, meaning not sequentially?
Yeah, great question. So you can definitely do them not sequentially. You could do them concurrently. But for us, what we're doing is taking the survey findings from the work sites and using those to help develop questions that we will be asking or that have already, informed the questions for the coordinators that we asked. So we looked at the survey data and use that to help develop the instrument. And then we're also going to do that for the case study. So we have information from the work sites, and we're going to look at those particular responses, and we have an instrument guide, but we'll also be able to tailor and have some specific questions to get a little bit deeper into some of those responses.
Great, thank you. So our next question, I think maybe both of you could probably provide some input onto. What are ways to most effectively and efficiently identify key informants for the qualitative interviews?
Go for it, Keshia.
All right. Thanks, Paul. I will start by saying every time we've done any sort of stakeholder interviews, we begin with a really stakeholder analysis, where you spend some time understanding the intervention or the policy decisions, understanding who the players are, and there are some specific tools that you can use to do your stakeholder analysis to understand who the people are, what their positions are, what their perspectives are. So for this workplace study, for example, we spent a lot of time talking to our partners at the State Department of Health to understand the program. You know, we started by thinking, well, we're just going to interview all of the coordinators, the regional coordinators across the state for our workplace project. And then we realized that there was also benefit to interviewing the person who oversees all of them because that particular person was mentioned in all of our interviews. And so, you know, that was another stakeholder we didn't think of initially to interview because we were already sort of working with that person at the state. They helped us find the regional coordinators. And so the thing I would say to you is really understand your issue. Talk to the people who have history on the program and who oversee the program. And, you know, we were really fortunate that with the partnership with the State Department of Health, they made the connections and sent us the email addresses that we were using to reach out to the coordinators. And then I think just be flexible. As I said, we didn't go in thinking that we were going to also interview the person who oversees the regional coordinators, but that person was mentioned in the interview, so you know that person was then added to our sample of people to speak with. And as far as, I'll just say one more thing, as far as the work sites, when we get out for our multiple case study, we will start with, our plan is to start with the HR individuals, the HR reps at the businesses, and then also talk to the coordinators who are at the part of the state where that business is located and ask them for also some key informants that we should contact.
Great. Thank you. Paul, do you have anything to add, or should we move forward? I have one more question. We have one more question I do want to get to. You're good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, all right, great. So this last question, I think, is something that's great. That's very applicable to particularly what active living research is focused on, trying to get research used outside of just for the sake of research, but kind of into practice and policy areas. So this question, how can these frameworks be used outside of academia to create, influence, and pass public health and environment policies on local, state, and federal levels?
Well, you know, I guess I'll jump in on this one, and you know, I don't really see that these models are necessarily tied to academia. Obviously, that's where they're generated and where they've come from. But I think as you look across implementation science models, you know, things like, and for those who were asking about references and stuff, I have added references to all my slides and sent those out to Chad, so you should be able to get those when that's posted as a PDF. But I think that, you know, many of the developers of these are folks that are working in practice, that are people that wear hats as practitioners and researchers, and so I think that there's a lot more pragmatism in these types of models. And you know, it's like, you know, anything that we're talking about, it provides us with potential mechanisms by which we can help to speed the process of implementation, so that evidence is actually getting into the hands and of the folks that can use it, and so the population can benefit. I think that our work and there's a really strong movement, and you know, it's called by a lot of different names. Some people use the community-based participatory research model. Some people use academic community partnerships. Some folks like us use the language of integrated research practice partnerships, where, you know, we really do start to have a shared production of evidence between those who would ultimately benefit from the work that we do, those who would use the evidence base that we create, and also those that can give us ideas for future work that we would do primarily on the research time to try and test out new mechanisms for implementation. So I see it as a pretty practical field, and you know, my my suggestion would be for folks to continue to look for research that is multidisciplinary, and within that definition includes community partners that interface with the public.
And this is Keshia. I'll just add, I agree with Paul that these frameworks and models are very pragmatic, and I don't think of them also as sort of just being for academics. I think one of the great things about the work we do around active living research is that I think when we see something working somewhere, or we see something that's innovative, or we think it's working, we can apply these types of methods and approaches to say, well, you know, how is it working, and what are those challenges? And I think that's what we need to understand more of in order to promote scalability and to really think about how do we disseminate it broadly to other audiences. So I think it's really understanding that process is just such a great benefit of this work, and I think that many of us can use these methods and approaches to help continue to advance active living.
Thank you both. So I think with that we are at our time. We're going to run slightly over. I just want to, on behalf of Active Living Research, thank everyone for participating in today's event. I would especially like to thank both Paul and Keshia for the presentations and efforts in studying policy implementation. And we hope that our webinar attendees will be able to apply what you've learned in your own research. So just finally, just a reminder to be sure to check out the resources that are available through the Active Living Research website. And when you finish this webinar, we ask that you please complete the evaluation survey. It will pop up just momentarily. So with that, this concludes our webinar. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.